I've seen things no one should ever see, but what we found beneath that site, it still haunts me. I wasn't always like this. Back then, I was just trying to move on. After leaving the Marines, I thought I'd seen it all. War zones, sleepless nights, the kind of fear that tightens in your chest until you can barely breathe. I thought nothing else in this world could truly shake me. But nothing could have prepared me for what we found beneath the ground in Arkansas. It was supposed to be an easy gig, a diamond mining site tucked away in the middle of nowhere, quiet, peaceful, just some long hours underground and a paycheck at the end of the week. The site had a history, sure, every place like that does, but we didn't care about the rumors. The only thing on my mind was the job. Get in, get out, move on. Simple, or so I thought. You ever step into a place and feel like it's watching you? Like the walls, the floor, even the air itself knows you don't belong? That's what it was like from the moment we arrived. The site manager, a guy named Jenkins, laughed it off when I mentioned it. Mining messes with your head, he said. Spend enough time underground and you'll start imagining all kinds of things. But I wasn't imagining it. I could feel it. Something there, just out of reach, like it was waiting for us to notice it. At first, it was small things. Equipment going missing, lights flickering even when the power was steady. One guy, an older miner named Charlie, swore he heard someone calling his name from one of the side tunnels. We laughed it off, told him it was just the wind. But Charlie wasn't the kind of man to get scared. And the way he looked at me after, his face was pale, his hands shaking. He never went back down that tunnel again. By the second week, the unease was spreading. The nights felt longer, the air heavier. Even the locals wouldn't come near the site. I remember one of them, a man in his 70s, hunched over, his hands worn and calloused from decades of work. He looked at me with these eyes that seemed older than the earth itself and said, "Some things were never meant to be disturbed. You dig deep enough, and you'll find things that were buried for a reason." I should have listened to him. God, I should have listened. On the surface, it was just another job. Long hours, hard work. But underneath, something was different. You could feel it when you stepped into the tunnels. The darkness wasn't like normal darkness. It wasn't just the absence of light. It felt alive, like it was pressing against you, suffocating you. And the deeper we went, the worse it got. It happened on a Wednesday. I'll never forget that day. We were nearly 300 feet down when we hit something unusual, a solid stone wall, perfectly smooth, like it had been carved. Jenkins thought it was natural, just a fluke of geology, but the rest of us weren't so sure. There were markings on it, symbols none of us recognized, etched deep into the rock. The geologist we had on site, Dr. Harper, said it didn't match anything in the area. He called it an anomaly. I called it a warning. We should have stopped there. We should have sealed the tunnel and left that wall untouched. But Jenkins couldn't leave it alone. He said we'd come too far, spent too much money. We dig through, he said. That's what we're here for. And so we did. We broke through. What we found on the other side, it wasn't a cave, it wasn't a chamber. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. The air was colder, so cold that our breath froze in front of us. The walls, they weren't rock. They were something smoother, almost metallic, but ancient, like they'd been there for longer than we could comprehend. And the smell, God, I'll never forget that smell. It wasn't decay, it wasn't rot. It was worse. It was wrong. That was the first time we heard it, the sound, like a low guttural vibration coming from deep within the earth. It wasn't natural. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard before, and it wasn't long before we realized it wasn't alone. You think you've seen fear? You think you know what it feels like to be truly powerless? Let me tell you, you don't. Not until you face something you can't understand, something that doesn't belong in this world. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the day it all started, and to the day everything changed forever. I suppose I should tell you a little about myself, about how I ended up in a place like that. I wasn't born into this kind of work. Far from it. I'm an ex-Marine, Spent over a decade in the service. I've been to places you wouldn't believe. Deserts that never seem to end. Jungles so thick you'd swear they were alive. And battlefields where every sound could mean life or death. I learned to trust my instincts, to rely on my training, and to keep going, even when fear gnawed at the edges of my mind. But none of it, prepared me for what I found in that mine. When I left the Marines, I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for peace, for quiet. But peace doesn't pay the bills, and quiet doesn't fill your fridge. So when a buddy of mine mentioned a private diamond mining operation in Arkansas that was looking for able-bodied men, I thought, why not? They promised good money, and honestly, I figured it'd just be hard labor. Breaking rocks, long shifts underground, nothing I couldn't handle. The site was remote, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless forest. No cell service, no roads worth calling roads, just trees, hills, and an eerie kind of stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. The kind of place that feels untouched, forgotten by time. The site manager, Jenkins, greeted me with a handshake that felt just a little too tight, his eyes darting around like he was trying to see if I'd noticed something. I shrugged it off. I didn't care about his quirks. I was there to work. The team was a mix of characters. There was Charlie, the oldest miner on the crew, with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of stone, and a laugh that could shake the walls of a tunnel. Then there was Carter, a young guy fresh out of college, working as an assistant to Dr. Harper, the geologist. Harper was different. She wasn't like the miners. She had this fascination with the land, with what she called its layers of history. Always scribbling in her notebook, always muttering to herself about anomalies and formations. And then, of course, there was Jenkins, the project manager. Jenkins didn't care about the history. All he cared about was results, diamonds, and lots of them. He was pushy, impatient, like a man on a deadline no one else knew about. The site itself wasn't much to look at. Just a few prefab buildings, some rusted equipment, and a narrow shaft leading straight down into the earth. But the locals, they had stories. Oh, they had plenty of stories. They called the land cursed, said it wasn't meant for digging. One old man told us about people disappearing, miners who went down and never came back up. Another swore he heard voices coming from the tunnels, whispers carried on the wind. Most of us laughed it off. Superstition, we said, just stories to keep outsiders away. But even the locals wouldn't come near the site. They refused. And when they talked about it, it wasn't with anger or even fear. It was something deeper. Reverence, maybe, like they knew something we didn't. And Jenkins just smiled and told us to get back to work. He didn't care about the locals, didn't care about their warnings. All he cared about was digging deeper, finding more, faster. And the rest of us, we needed the money. So we listened to Jenkins, not to the stories. The first week was uneventful. Long shifts, hard labor, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something about that mine, something you could feel, even when nothing was happening. The air down there, it wasn't like normal air. It felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing against your chest. And the silence, it wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you think you're hearing things. Breathing, footsteps that aren't yours, voices that stop the second you turn your head. Charlie was the first to notice it. Said he felt like he was being watched. We laughed at him, told him it was just the dark playing tricks on him. But then Carter started noticing it too. He swore he saw something, just a shadow, he said, moving at the edge of his light. And Harper? She started spending more time in the tunnels, taking notes, whispering to herself about the anomalies. She said the rock formations didn't make sense, that they didn't match anything in the region. Jenkins told her to stop wasting time, but she wouldn't let it go. And honestly, neither could I. There was something about that place that got under your skin. It wasn't just the work or the isolation or even the stories. It was something else, something you couldn't quite put your finger on. And the deeper we went, the worse it got. The walls started to feel closer, the air got colder, and the noises, they weren't just in our heads anymore. We didn't know it yet, but we were digging into something we should have left alone, something that had been waiting, watching. And once we found it, there was no going back. I didn't believe the stories at first. None of us did. But now I wish I'd listened, because by the time we realized the truth, it was too late. The first few days at the site were hard work, just as I'd expected. Long hours in the tunnels, the air thick with dust, the sounds of pickaxes striking rock echoing endlessly. For the most part, it was uneventful, just back-breaking labor. But there was something about the place that didn't sit right with me from the beginning. Little things at first, things you could shrug off if you weren't paying attention. Like how the generator powering the lights would flicker for no reason, even though Jenkins swore it was brand new. Or how the air down in the tunnels was colder than it should have been, colder than the deepest caves I'd ever been in. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that only worked for so long. On the second day, Carter lost his headlamp. He swore he'd left it on the workbench at the entrance to the shaft, but when we looked, it was gone. Jenkins rolled his eyes, muttered something about rookies being careless, and handed Carter a spare. It wasn't a big deal, until we found it later that evening. It was sitting in the deepest part of the tunnel we'd been working in, placed neatly on a flat stone, like someone, or something, had put it there on purpose. Jenkins just laughed, said one of us must have moved it and forgotten, but none of us admitted to it. By the third night, the unease was getting harder to ignore. That was the first time I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from deep within the shaft. It wasn't loud, just barely audible over the hum of the generator, but it was there. I froze, straining to hear it again, but it was gone. I told myself it was the wind, maybe an animal. But wind doesn't sound like that. And what kind of animal would be down here, buried hundreds of feet underground? I didn't say anything to the others, didn't want to sound like I was losing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. By the fifth day, things started to get worse. The machinery began to fail. Not all at once, but little by little. The drill we used to break through the tougher rock kept overheating, even though it was brand new. The lights flickered more frequently, plunging us into brief moments of darkness that felt longer than they should have. And the air, it wasn't just cold anymore. It felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. Even Charlie, who'd been working in mines for decades, started complaining about headaches and nausea. "It's just the dust," Jenkins said, but it didn't feel like the dust. And then there were the shadows. I didn't notice them at first, not consciously, but by the end of that week, I couldn't ignore them anymore. They didn't move like normal shadows. They were slower, thicker, like they were dragging themselves across the walls. Sometimes I thought I saw them move even when there was no one nearby to cast them. Carter saw them too. One night, he swore he saw a shadow standing perfectly still at the end of the tunnel. When he shined his flashlight on it, it was gone. But the feeling it left behind, that stayed. On the seventh day, we broke through to the chamber. We weren't looking for it. It wasn't on any of the maps Jenkins had shown us. It was just there, hidden behind a wall of solid rock. The moment the drill pierced through, the air changed. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was freezing. I could see my breath clouding in front of me, and my fingers went numb in seconds. Charlie pulled back the drill, and we all stood there, staring at the hole in the rock. Jenkins was the first to speak. "Well," he said, "what are you waiting for? Open it up." It took us hours to break through the wall. The rock was harder than anything we'd encountered before, almost like it didn't want to be broken. But when we finally cleared the opening, we saw it. A chamber, dark and silent, like it had been waiting for us. The walls were smooth, unnaturally smooth, like they'd been carved by something far more precise than human hands. And then there were the symbols. They were etched into the stone, covering every inch of the chamber. I didn't recognize them. None of us did. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen. jagged, overlapping shapes that seemed to shift and twist when you looked at them for too long. Harper was the first to step inside. She was fascinated, running her hands over the symbols, muttering to herself about how they didn't match any known language or culture. "This is incredible," she said. "This could change everything we know about." But Jenkins cut her off. He didn't care about history or culture. All he cared about was what might be buried beneath the chamber. "Diamonds," he said. "This is just a distraction," he told us. "Get back to work." But none of us wanted to leave. There was something about the chamber that drew you in, something that made it impossible to look away, and the longer we stayed, the worse it got. The air felt heavier, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows didn't stay on the walls anymore. We should have stopped. We should have sealed it back up and walked away. But we didn't, and by the time we realized what we'd uncovered, it was already too late. We should have left the chamber alone, sealed it back up, and pretended we'd never found it. But curiosity is a dangerous thing, especially when you're standing on the edge of something you don't understand. The moment we breached that wall, the entire site seemed to come alive. At first, it was subtle, lights flickering, the occasional tremor in the ground. But as the hours passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. The symbols on the walls, those jagged, twisting shapes, started to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. At first, we thought it was a trick of the light, but the longer we stared, the more it became clear. They were alive, reacting to something we couldn't see. Jenkins, ever the skeptic, brushed it off. "Just some kind of phosphorescence," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But Harper wasn't convinced. She ran her fingers over the carvings, her face pale. "This isn't natural," she whispered. "These symbols, they're not just markings, they're warnings." That's when the ground started trembling beneath us. It wasn't constant, just brief, jarring vibrations, like something massive shifting far below. Carter joked that we'd hit an underground river, but deep down, we all knew it wasn't water. It happened on the 8th night. We were working late, trying to map out the chamber and figure out if there was anything valuable buried beneath it. That's when we heard it, a voice calling from the tunnels. It wasn't loud, just barely audible over the hum of the generator, but it was unmistakable. It was saying a name, Jenkins's name. "Who's messing with me?" Jenkins growled, his face a mixture of irritation and unease. No one answered, and then we heard it again, louder this time. "Jenkins, come here." It was coming from the side tunnel, the one we hadn't fully explored yet. Without waiting for backup, Jenkins grabbed his flashlight and stomped off into the darkness. "Stay here," he barked at us. "I'll handle it." We waited, 5 minutes, 10, 15, but Jenkins didn't come back. Finally, Carter and I went after him. We found his flashlight first, lying on the ground with the bulb shattered. Then we found his helmet. It was lying on its side, covered in deep, jagged claw marks, like something had torn at it with inhuman strength. But there was no sign of Jenkins. No blood, no footprints, just nothing. We called his name over and over, our voices echoing uselessly through the tunnels. But the only answer we got was the sound of that voice, distorted now, almost mocking, repeating his name from somewhere deeper in the mine. By the time we returned to the chamber, Harper was in a frenzy. She'd been studying the carvings on the walls, sketching them in her notebook. "You need to see this," she said, her voice trembling. "These symbols, they're not just decorative, they're a warning." She pointed to one section of the wall, where the carvings formed a spiral around a central figure. It was crude but unmistakable, a massive, inhuman shape with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Beneath it, the symbols formed a single phrase, repeated over and over. Harper had managed to translate it. "Do not awaken the buried guardian." Before we could process what she'd said, we heard it. A deep, resonant grinding noise coming from the far end of the chamber. We turned to see a massive stone slab slowly sliding away, revealing a hidden alcove. Inside was a sarcophagus, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was enormous, easily 8 feet long, made of black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. The carvings on its surface were even more intricate than those on the walls, and they seemed to ripple and shift as we watched. "We need to leave," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." But Jenkins, or whatever was left of him, wasn't there to give the order, and the rest of the team was too curious for their own good. Carter approached the sarcophagus, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "What do you think's inside?" he muttered. Before anyone could stop him, he reached out and touched the surface. The moment his fingers made contact, the carvings lit up, blindingly bright. The air in the chamber turned freezing cold, so cold it burned my skin. The ground beneath us began to quake violently, and a deafening screech filled the air, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We stumbled back as the lid of the sarcophagus began to shift, sliding open inch by inch. The smell hit us first, a sickening mix of decay and sulfur that made my stomach churn. And then it emerged. I can barely describe what I saw. It wasn't just a creature. It was wrong, like it didn't belong in our world. Its form shifted constantly, a grotesque amalgamation of shadow and bone, with limbs that bent in impossible angles. Its eyes, or what I think were its eyes, were empty voids, sucking in the light around them. Just looking at it made my head throb and my vision blur. The air felt heavier, crushing, like the very presence of this thing was rewriting the laws of reality. We should have run. We should have turned and left that place, no matter the cost. But we didn't, and that decision would haunt us for the rest of our lives. The air in the tunnels had changed. It was heavier now, thick with a damp, metallic stench that made every breath feel like swallowing rust. The creature was awake, and it was hunting us. We didn't see it at first, but we felt it. You couldn't mistake the sensation, the low vibration that rumbled through the walls, the subtle shift in the shadows, the icy prickle that climbed up your spine. It wasn't just in the chamber anymore, it was everywhere. "Do you hear that?" Carter whispered, his voice trembling. We all froze. There it was again, that sound, a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging against stone. It was coming from the tunnel behind us, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. And then came the growl, deep, guttural, and impossibly close, vibrating through my chest like a low thunderclap. It wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. We ran. It didn't matter where, as long as it was away from that noise. Our flashlights bounced wildly, their beams swallowed by the oppressive darkness. No matter how fast we moved, the sound followed us, those claws scraping, that growl reverberating through the stone walls. And then we heard it, Jenkins's voice. "Wait!" Carter shouted, slowing down. "It's Jenkins!" But I grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. "That's not Jenkins," I hissed. And I knew it wasn't because the voice was all wrong. It was Jenkins's words, but not his tone. It was hollow, distorted, like something trying to mimic him, but getting it just slightly off. Carter hesitated, torn between fear and hope, and in that moment, the darkness swallowed him whole. I didn't even see it happen. One moment Carter was there, and the next he was gone. No blood, no sound of struggle, just an empty space where he'd been standing, and the growling, it was closer now. That left just me and Harper. She was shaking, clutching the geologist's notebook to her chest like it was a lifeline. "We're not getting out of here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You know that, right?" I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we'd make it out together. But deep down, I knew she was right. The creature was too fast, too relentless. It wasn't going to let us leave. Not alive, anyway. That's when the idea hit me. I remembered the explosives. We'd brought them to break through tougher rock, but now they might be our only chance. If I could rig them to collapse the tunnels, maybe, just maybe, I could trap the thing down here. But there was a catch. Someone had to stay behind to lure it into the blast zone, and I knew Harper wouldn't survive if it came to that. "Go," I told her. She stared at me, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not leaving you," she said. But I didn't give her a choice. I shoved her towards the exit, screaming at her to run, and turned back towards the darkness. The tunnel was silent now, except for my breathing and the faint hum of the glowing symbols on the walls. I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing down on me like a physical weight, and then it spoke. "We see you," it said, in a dozen voices at once. Jenkins, Carter, even Harper. It was mocking me, trying to break me. But I didn't let it. I clenched my fists and shouted into the void, "Come on, you bastard! Is that all you've got?" My voice echoed back at me, hollow and weak, and then it appeared. I wish I could say I got a good look at it, but the truth is, you can't look at something like that. Not fully. Its form shifted constantly, a chaotic swirl of shadow and bone, its limbs stretching and twisting like smoke in a windless room. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were voids of pure darkness, pulling at my thoughts, dragging me into a spiral of fear and madness. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the detonator in my hand. It didn't charge at me, not at first. It just stood there, watching, like it was waiting for something. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged. I pressed the detonator. The blast knocked me off my feet, the force of it slamming me into the tunnel wall. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of the creature's scream, a high-pitched, unnatural wail that seemed to echo forever, and then silence. When I woke up, the air was thick with dust and the tunnel was completely sealed. The explosives had done their job, but I was trapped, alone, in the dark, with no way out. I don't know how long I was down there, hours, days, time lost all meaning, but eventually I saw a light. Harper had come back for me, against all odds. She helped me out of the rubble, her face pale but determined. "It's gone," she said. "Whatever it was, it's gone." But I'm not so sure. Sometimes late at night I still hear it, the growling, the scraping, the whispers, and every time I close my eyes I see those symbols glowing in the dark. I don't think we killed it. I think we just woke it up. We climbed out of the rubble into the cold night air. Harper pulled me up, her face a mix of relief and fear. The forest around us was silent, too silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I looked back at the collapsed tunnel. Dust and smoke still rose from the blast site, curling into the moonlit sky. It was over, or so I thought. Harper kept saying it was gone, that the thing had been buried under tons of rock. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made a mistake, like we hadn't destroyed it, just trapped it. I didn't say anything to her. She was too shaken, and honestly, I didn't want to scare her even more. We started walking, heading back toward the main camp in silence, but something wasn't right. As we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt wrong. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their shadows stretching unnaturally long in the moonlight. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was still shaken from what we'd been through. But then I heard it. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But Harper froze. She'd heard it too. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, forcing a laugh. "It's just the wind," I said, though I didn't believe it for a second. We quickened our pace, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and the site. But the sound followed us, faint and distant, like it was just out of reach. The growling, the scraping, and then the whispers. They were so quiet, so faint, that I almost thought they were in my head. But Harper heard them too. Her face went pale, and she grabbed my arm. "We're not alone," she said. I didn't know how to answer her because I felt it too, that overwhelming sense of being watched. When we finally made it back to the camp, it was empty. The other miners had fled, leaving behind only scattered tools and half-packed bags. The vehicles were gone, the tents torn down. There was no sign of anyone. Harper and I searched the area, calling out for anyone who might still be there. But all we found were tracks, footprints leading away from the camp into the forest. And they weren't alone. Beside the human tracks were deep, claw-like impressions, trailing alongside them. Whatever had been in that tunnel, it wasn't buried, it was free. I wanted to leave immediately, but the trucks were gone. We had no choice but to stay the night. Harper and I barricaded ourselves inside the geologist's cabin, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, clutching our flashlights, jumping at every creak and groan of the old wood. And all night long, I thought I could hear it, scratching at the edges of the forest, just beyond the light. We made it out the next morning, hitching a ride from a local logging crew that found us walking down the old service road. I never went back to the site. Neither did Harper. We didn't talk about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. We just tried to move on. But the thing is, you can't move on from something like that. For months after, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those symbols glowing in the dark. I heard the whispers, the growls, the scratching. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was traumatized and imagining things. But then, the package arrived. It showed up on my doorstep one morning, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a package meant for someone else, but when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside was a single object, a piece of stone, smooth and black, with a familiar symbol etched into its surface. One of the symbols from the chamber. There was no note, no explanation, just that piece of stone. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't even touch it. I shoved it back into the box and locked it in the basement, hoping I could forget about it. But I couldn't, because that night the whispers came back, louder this time, clearer, and they were calling my name. I thought I'd left it behind, buried under rock and rubble, but now I know the truth. You can't escape something like that. It's not over. It was never over. And every time I hear those whispers, every time I see those symbols in my dreams, I know it's coming for me. And when it does, I don't think I'll be able to stop it this time. What would you do if it were you? Could you face something like this, or would you run? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever felt like something was watching you, you're not alone. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, stay in the light. If you've made it this far, I have to ask, have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Something that stayed with you long after it should have been over? Maybe it was just a shadow in the corner of your room, or a whisper you were sure came from empty air. I want to know, what's the one thing that still keeps you up at night? Share your story in the comments below. You never know. It might just help someone else realize they're not alone. And if you felt the weight of this story, if you could feel the chill of the tunnels and the whispers in the dark, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss another chilling tale. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. This isn't the end of my story, though. The whispers, the claw marks, the package on my doorstep, they weren't just a warning, they were a call. I thought I could leave the darkness behind, but sometimes you don't get to choose when the past lets go of you. Next time, I'll tell you what happened when I decided to go back to that site to face the darkness one last time. Let's just say I wasn't ready for what I found. Until then, stay safe, and whatever you do, stay in the light.